Well, hi everyone. Welcome to another week of First Day USD. It's going by quickly. It's hard to believe that we're already halfway through, and just a couple more weeks left after this. I really appreciate all of the enthusiasm you've brought to the first 2 weeks, and hope that continues today. And it should, because we have just a really fantastic lineup of speakers today. I can say that because it happens to include three of my absolute closest colleagues and folks that I've had the pleasure to work with in various capacities, who are all brilliant and will be um, giving you slightly different perspectives on the broader theme of broadening and empowering climate advocacy, something that's very close to my heart as well. And are we going in the order that was published? So, Dr. Cantzler, are you be going first, or who's going to start us off?
I'm going to start us off.
Then I will hand it over to you, Dr. Talley, who's going to be giving us a really wonderful presentation on women development and the climate crisis. Take it away, Dr. Talley.
Thank you very much. Don't let him set your expectations too high. I'm going to give a okay talk, so
They
let's
are
see how
so
this works.
brilliant. You've never met anyone as brilliant as these three people. How's that for setting high expectations?
Perfect. Okay. So it is an absolute delight to be a part of this program and this class. My name is Drew Talley. I'm a professor in the Environmental and Ocean Sciences Department, and I teach a bunch of different classes, mostly about wetland ecology, island biogeography, statistics, physical oceanography, a few other things like that. So today, what I want to talk to you about is some non-obvious solutions to the climate crisis. To give you an idea of where I'm headed with this, I'm going to start by just talking broadly about what climate change is and why we should care about it. And then I'll talk about some of the STEM, which means science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So the sort of sciencey solutions that we often think of when we think about how we're going to try and mitigate climate change. And then I'll talk about sort of my main point here about how educating women and girls is actually one of the most effective ways we can fight climate change. So I know this first part, what is climate change? Some of you are probably rolling your eyes and thinking, I don't need to hear that. But I just want to make sure we're all on the same page before we go. So this is just a sort of climate change primer. The climate change that we're seeing now is caused largely by this greenhouse effect, which is a normal natural process where energy from the sun ends up getting held as heat on Earth because of these things we call greenhouse gases, the different gases that trap that heat. So in itself, greenhouse effect is not a bad thing at all. I just want to be super clear about that. We as humans have made it more, a lot stronger than it has been historically. But without greenhouse gases, the Earth would be uninhabitable. So it is important to keep in mind that in itself, it's not a bad thing, but what we have done is really increase the amount of greenhouse gases and therefore increased the warming and the various effects that we see from that. And when you think about what those greenhouse gases are, boy, there's a bunch of them. Even things like water vapor, uh, methane, fluorocarbons, all these fancy chemicals that you get in, like spray bottles, et cetera. But also CO2 is one of the biggest ones. And we'll talk a little bit more about carbon dioxide in a minute. Because that's kind of, since it's such a dominant one, that's the one that people tend to measure when they're looking at it. Greenhouse gases don't entirely, let's talk about CO2 specifically, don't entirely, it's not like once you make it, it's now we have all that gas in the atmosphere, blanketing the earth and making it warmer. There are things that we call sinks, so places that these greenhouse gases get sucked up and taken out of the atmosphere. The oceans are probably one of the largest sinks. About 50% of greenhouse gases gets sucked up by CO2, either dissolving into the water or being taken up by things like algae and plants in the water. But also plants on land are a big deal. And as you can see from this picture, I'm of course showing a little bit of the negative side of this. The oceans, as they're getting warmer, the water itself can't hold as much CO2. And when you look at plants on Earth, we are burning and bulldozing an awful lot of trees around the world, including our rainforests. So we are not only adding more greenhouse gases, but we're sort of destroying the sinks that would be taking these greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And this next one, what are the effects? I mean, either one of these could be an entire course. So I am just going to quickly say, boy, there's a lot of stuff that is caused by climate change. The spread of disease, the heat waves, as many of you are probably experiencing or have experienced this summer, damage to fisheries, the extreme weather like hurricanes. There are a ton of negative effects that we are seeing from climate change and these greenhouse gases. Okay, so one thing I want to talk about is the sort of things that first pop into my mind anyway when I think how would we try to mitigate these climate change effects, and that is what I'm calling these STEM solutions. There's a bunch of them. I'm not going to talk about all of them obviously, but I want to talk about the ones that sort of I think pop into most people's minds first when you start thinking about these. um, so that'll include renewable energy, which would be windmills or solar farms or solar panels generally, using electric vehicles instead of combustion engines, converting to a plant-based diet, and then recycling is another way that people are trying to help eliminate or alter and reduce climate change effects. So let me talk a little bit, and I should caution you that this is going to be a theme for the rest of while I'm talking to you, and that is that things are complicated and there's no easy, every time I'm giving you something that's a positive, almost each time you can be like, yeah, but there is this downside. So I just want to prep you for that because you're going to hear that a lot. And rooftop solar is a great example. So these are solar panels that not too long ago were installed on the roof of our building here in Shiley Center for Science and Technology on USD campus. And rooftop solar is a great idea, right? You capture the sun's energy and you turn it into clean power. So you're not burning fossil fuels or adding any CO2 to get that power. Um, there are some downsides to it. Some areas aren't very good for it because you need clear weather and a lot of sun. There's a lot of pollution that's created in the formation of these panels, and you're creating greenhouse gases while you're building, shipping, and installing these rooftop solar. But I will say it is pretty great and increasingly popular. I just wanted to show a little bit of data here. This is going back to 1975 when we really started to get this technology. It started to sort of get its stride going here. But look at the cost per module, so per panel back then. You're looking at $130 or so per panel. You can see that through time, that blue line just plummets. So the cost, we've gotten way better and more efficient at making these things. And once those costs hit a certain threshold here in the early 2000s, you started to suddenly see, boy, this is on the y-axis, it's global solar capacity, something called gigawatts. All you need to think of it as is, wow, there's people using a lot more solar panels through time. Seems to be related to the cost going down and also energy crunches. All right, let's address electric vehicles because there are a lot of great things about electric vehicles. Again, you're using, depending on where you're getting your energy from, you could be using solar power to power your car. Again, way less greenhouse gas emissions coming from the car. On the other hand, it depends on where you get your electricity. There are some areas that all the electricity on the grid is coming from old-fashioned, burning of oil or coal. And so there you're creating a ton of pollution to make that electricity in the first place. And of course, as everything else, you're creating greenhouse gases when you're building, shipping, and installing these things. But again, I would like to point out we are definitely headed in the right direction here. This is the number of electric vehicles, just cars actually here, sold worldwide in thousands. So you can see it has really taken off as well. So electric vehicles, again, it's not perfect, but it's a pretty good system, and people are starting to use it a lot more. One of the other things you might not think of, but is how important it is that the more plant-based your diet is, how much that reduces your impact on greenhouse gases. So you're probably like, well, what have you got against cows? Honestly, nothing. Cows are cool and they're delicious, but it's worth noting that they create a ton of greenhouse gases, both from their emissions. You probably have heard about cow gas. Like, actually, it's mostly them belching, but the way they're digesting their food, they're releasing a lot of methane, which is a super powerful greenhouse gas. But also, as I mentioned earlier, we are burning huge sections of rainforest to make cattle ranches because meat is so valuable. The crops that we grow off are releasing greenhouse gases and eliminating plants and trees that could be using it, fertilizers. So there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about that. But there are solutions. We can switch over to a more plant-based diet. You can even, I'm sure many of you have seen the Beyond burgers and these sort of synthetic burgers and meats that have come out. Again, they're not perfect because all of these are requiring, you're creating greenhouse gases to some degree to make these things, but you can also be having a much lighter effect on the environment by doing so. One more thing I want to talk about a little bit is recycling. One of the things is a picture of a landfill. Our landfills, especially if there's a lot of the things that we dump into landfills start releasing greenhouse gases while they're there in these sort of low oxygen conditions. And so recycling is one thing that gives us a bit of a lighter footprint on the world. So yeah, there's a lot of great things about recycling, and I think we should all be doing it. Some of the problems, though, there are downsides. Contamination is a big issue. There are, if you throw one greasy pizza box into some of the city's recycling things, it'll destroy the entire load of recycling that they had, and it gets contaminated, so they have to dump it. So contamination is a big problem. Even having proper recycling in your neighborhood or at your work, there's huge costs involved with it. It is not, while you do make money off of recycling aluminum, for example, often the cost to recycle that aluminum is more than you're actually getting out of it. So many of these things have to be subsidized. And also, again, like everything else in this processing, you're using a lot of energy and water and creating these greenhouse gases. Okay, so let's ignore the downsides and just think about what data we have on how effective these current solutions are using the technology that we currently have. Before I do that, I'm sorry, I need to briefly step back and hang on, I need to briefly step back and talk about how we measure greenhouse gases. Since CO2 is the most abundant, carbon dioxide is the most abundant greenhouse gas, we tend to measure the output and storage of CO2 as just, well, how much carbon are we letting out into the atmosphere or taking out of the atmosphere? And I'm telling you this because the standard measure that we use is a gigaton of carbon, which is 1 billion tons, or I wrote it out as a number there, right? Huge amount of carbon. My problem is 1 billion just doesn't mean much to me as a number. I'm like, I don't know what a billion's a lot, but I don't know how much of a lot that is. So I thought, well, you know what? Maybe I'll look up like something related to something we can think of. The first thing I got was like, well, that a gigaton is the weight of 1 million blue whales. which at first I was like, well, that's cool. But then I realized I can't imagine what a million blue whales looks like. So I tried to find another way of measuring a gigaton. And the one that I found that I think, even though it's still tough to conceptualize, I think it helps is the weight of half of the Earth's population as far as people is concerned, which is kind of amazing, right? So it's a crazy, huge number. So when I'm talking about gigatons in the next couple slides, just remember, okay, each one of those is like half the weight of the Earth's human population. Okay, so here's some data that I've collected talking about how much we would save in gigatons over 30 years using current technology for each of these things I've mentioned so far. So rooftop solar, you're looking at 48 gigatons. That seems like an awful lot. Electric cars, not as much as I expected, really, but still a substantial savings. The plant-based diet, that one's really huge, actually. That really saves a lot of greenhouse gases, and I think it's something worth thinking about in our own lives. Not that I avoid meat. Well, not that I totally avoid meat, but definitely thinking about your diet has an effect on this. And then recycling, pretty small, but still small in terms of gigatons, which is still an awful lot. Okay, so let me come back to this one. What is it about educating women and girls that creates benefits for combating climate change? Well, one of the big ones, so this is like, and it looks so much like a win-win on the outside. You're like, wow, we're educating people and we're fixing climate change. It's a little more complicated than that, but yeah, there is a lot of win-win here. So educated women are better at understanding climate change and global disasters. And so they're also going to be, if you've educated women, they're going to be more like better stewards of the environment. So they'll be thinking more about climate change and trying to live a life that leads to less greenhouse gases being dumped into the world. It's also worth noting that if people are educated, they tend to make more money. When women are earning an education, they're earning more money, and that is going to buffer them against some of the impacts of climate change and allow them to actually have the ability to do more to impact climate change themselves. This one is just sort of an extra benefit, and that is just that educated mothers spend more of their resources towards nutrition for their kids. So it's going to improve their kids' health. Healthier people, all things being equal, tend to be creating less greenhouse gases and having a lighter impact. This one, hang with me for a second, because this one sounds great, and then I want to tell you some things that bother me about this. So one thing worth noting is that educated women tend to have fewer children. And obviously, overpopulation is an issue with climate change. The more people that are on Earth, the more we're creating greenhouse gases, etc. Boy, I want you to be really careful when you think about this one, because there is, as far as humans go, probably, there has been this sort of long and troubling history of wealthier, more powerful individuals and governments attempting to control the reproduction of marginalized or poorer populations. And this is often intersected with issues of race and class and colonialism and even ableism. And if you don't believe me, for it's the German flag. So for many of you, you're like, oh yeah, when you think of the Nazis, they went out and sterilized a bunch of people who they considered inferior, and of course also committed mass genocide. So that was pretty bad. But you need to think about the US. I mean, many of you might not know that in the early 20th century, the wealthy elites and even influential scientists were promoting forced sterilization. It was called eugenics of people that they deemed unfit, often poor, disabled, and or non-white. So this actually was before the Nazis. Um, Also there's this event in the 50s and 60s in Puerto Rico called La Operación, which the US government and the pharmaceutical industry actually use the island of Puerto Rico as a testing ground for birth control and sterilization techniques. And this shocking fact is that by 1965, over a third of the women of childbearing age in Puerto Rico had been sterilized. And then finally, you have Canada. How could Canada do anything bad? They're so friendly. Well, starting in the 1960s, they coerced and misled Indigenous women into sterilization procedures. And it has recently turned out that this was even still happening in the 2000s. So I hope that those are just a few examples. But when we're saying, boy, wouldn't it be great if people had fewer kids, I'm all for that, but I also think we also need to think about cultural context and et cetera. And the other thing I would point out is a lot of people will look at, I used India as an example here. They're like, well, look at this. India has so many more people than the US, 4 times as many. We should be worried about India reducing their population. Well, one of the problems with that, of course, is that the average person in the US creates about 40 times the greenhouse gases of the average person in India. And so if you look at cumulative CO2 output, you can see that it's really us that is the big problem, not India. So I would just say with that one about populations, just be mindful of the fact that that there is a troubling history there. Getting more women in STEM is another aspect of this, right? If we educate more women and girls, we get more women entering these fields, and they're contributing to some of these solutions to climate change. Education tends to create more women leaders, and we've learned that governments with more women leaders are far more likely to enact environmental legislation. So that'll be a huge positive impact. And I just wanted to come back to this graph I had showed you earlier. So I put all those other ones up there, but let's look at what, and again, these are of course just estimates, but these are estimates of the gigatons of carbon saved over 30 years by educating girls and women. And what you can see is it even beats the plant-based diet one. So it really is largely a win-win situation to do this. So cool, that's easy. We just go out and we just start educating girls and women and we're all set, right? Well, unfortunately, no. And there are a bunch of different reasons for that. I'm just going to give one. There are cultural things going on and so many practical things. But let me give just one example of something that you might not have thought of right away. And that is that in many communities, and this is actually true in the United States as well, especially in some of the poorer communities, girls miss school or even drop out of school completely because of a lack of feminine hygiene supplies. That sounds like such a minor impediment, and yet it is a huge problem. And what I wanted to talk about briefly, just to segue as I'm going to wrap up, is that some countries' families can't afford feminine hygiene products. So girls will, when they get old enough to have their first period, they'll quit school. But what I started to think about was, right, this kind of diagram where there are all these different fields. I'm an oceanographer. I probably would not be a lot of use for trying to figure out solutions to women not having access to feminine hygiene supplies. On the other hand, an economist might have a solution to get more of these products into households. An engineer might be able to think of other cheaper ways to make them. And I was thinking about how all of these different fields and disciplines sort of impact this. And what it made me think about, I was like, God, that looks really familiar to me. It really made me start thinking about the liberal arts and what we do here at the University of San Diego. And if you look, you've got right now an oceanographer and a sociologist and someone in the IPJ. So we have all these different fields coming together. It can make it really tough because no one can do everything. But what it also means is that we can attack these problems from many angles. And it makes me think of the Greek myth of Hercules, um, where he was fighting the Hydra, which had all these different heads. Um, right, these issues are complex. No one person can do anything. But what it also means is that each one of us can do our share and pick something that we are good at and that we can leverage and work together to sort of conquer some of these problems. So that is kind of my take home here is that our individual actions can lead to this distributed global change. Um, that is some of my information if anyone wants to get a hold of me. And I think we will move on to our next speaker so you don't have to listen to me ramble anymore.
Thank you, Dr. Talley. That was very interesting and absolutely. So much to talk about. I'm sure we'll have some great questions. Who's next? Who's going to, is it you, Dr. Cantzler? Dr. Al-Marashi, please
I'm,
take it
I'm
away.
going next. So
Wonderful.
we're going from a global to now a regional perspective. We're going to look at how Professor Talley's lecture can be applied, in this case, to the Middle East, and why is the Middle East an important area to focus on, even though you might not have any obvious connections there. So, just to tell you, of course, I'm taking the lecture title from a graduation speech made by David Foster Wallace talking about This is Water, where I'm specifically going to be talking about water. Um, I'll give you my email. Unfortunately, I owe it to Professor Tyrrell that I was able to teach graduate students at USD, and I owe it to Professor Talley that I was able to guest lecture in his course. But my san diego.edu email might be closing down soon, so if you want to get in touch with me, I recommend using my San Diego State email. So I am combining in this lecture an approach. So at San Diego, University of San Diego, I teach political science at SDSU Public Health. At Cal State San Marcos History, you probably, and what I'm going to do is bring all three disciplines together. I'm not sure where you are, but if you are on the University of San Diego campus, I am in Guatemala, but the whenever I give a lecture on the USD campus, I always acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. I want to pay respect to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship to their ancestral lands. And, when I make this land acknowledgement, this is just the best way to demonstrate that not all nations have a state. And the Kumeyaay Nation are divided between four different states. Of course, the state of Alta California, Baja California, and then we tend to forget the United States of America borders the United States of Mexico. And so these are four states that divide the Kumeyaay Nation, a nation that doesn't have a state. But the Kumeyaay Nation also doesn't have what I would say is hydrological sovereignty. The Kumeyaay Nation also inhabits a river that, due to now politics, and when I get you to think of the politics, this is a field called border gnosis. Being aware of, Tijuana is not just a place to go to for, crossing the border. It's a play. It's also the name of a basin, a river basin as well. And of course, this is a river basin that affects all of our lives, but I'm going to go to a different river basin today. So what I'm going to talk about is both two fields I'm going to introduce you to. One is called theological ecology, and the other is political ecology. So what do I mean by each subject? So first of all, I'm pushing, and hopefully if you students fight for this, one day you could get it. USD needs a history of law course. And the history of law and the way river basins are regulated. I could tell you one of the longest wars of the 20th century was the Iran-Iraq War. And that began because international law failed to basically get two parties, Iraq and Iran, to agree on the divided river. And that's the river basin I'm going to be talking about today. But, hopefully you guys will take history. I mean, even the name of the business school, the Naus Business School, the guy who we name it after studied history. And I want you to appreciate that studying history will sometimes make you feel uncomfortable. It'll make you feel deeply upset. extremely angry. If studying history always makes you proud and happy, you probably aren't studying history. And so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you some history that is going to make you feel uncomfortable. And it begins with this. Our first historian is Taylor Swift. And this I have to give a acknowledgement to my partner Lisa, who introduced me and converted me to Swiftyism and made me a Swifty. I want you to think of the lyrics of this song. Hands on the prophecy. Okay, hands on the throttle, thought I caught lightning in a bottle. Oh, but it's gone again. And it was written, I got cursed like Eve got bitten. So I want you to think the first woman we're going to be talking about in today's lecture is Eve. Now, of course, the first, I mean, according to a lot, three faith systems, the Abrahamic faith system, the first woman on this planet, right? Now, why is Eve important to this story? Well, let's look at this image here. So, of course, this is Eve got bitten by the snake. The snake is handing Eve an apple. And I want you to think of the imagery here of the Garden of Eden. USD is a Catholic university, but, it's not just a Catholic university that teaches religious dogma. It's also, I want you to appreciate how it's a religious university that teaches us how to study religion analytically. And, I've given a lot of lectures for the theology department. People forget the Garden of Eden is actually referenced in the Bible in a specific location at the confluence of four rivers. And the question is, do those four rivers exist? No, two have dried up, but two still exist, and they're most likely references to the Tigris and Euphrates. So if the Garden of Eden was a real place, first of all, would it look like this? Would Adam and Eve look like this? And in the book of Genesis, the forbidden fruit is never mentioned. It's a myth that Eve was given an apple by a snake. And if you think of the kind of Genesis as a historical document referring to a specific place, most likely, if anything, that forbidden fruit was a reference to either a fig. Okay. And I want you to think when you bite open into a fig, how it looks like, but also remember the fig leaves that they wear? Or a pomegranate. And if you think of a forbidden fruit, something you open up and it has layers within that fruit, like the way knowledge works, it makes more sense. But why is Eve so important for this lecture? Well, number one, you see, we were talking about kind of gender issues. And this is where history might make some of you upset. Probably you don't realize in Victorian England, even though women, the medication to relieve pain during childbirth had been invented in Victorian England, but women were deliberately denied that pain relief medication while giving birth so that they pay for the original sin of Eve, you see. Women were collectively punished for that. Now, in this particular case, that's about history being made, making you upset. I'll just say as a aside, in the Islamic tradition, both Adam and Eve were equally guilty of partaking in the forbidden fruit. But nevertheless, the if we look at there, where would the Garden of Eden? You see, there's a couple of theories, right? But of course, it corresponds to modern day Iraq. And this is why I'm teaching you climate change is hitting Iraq and the Gulf like no other place on Earth. Uh, Basically, this is not only a place that is important theologically, but it's also important for another dynamic. Civilization, you probably take this word for granted. A good number of us scholars contest the word. It has very value laden. But nevertheless, let's just use civilization as a story of how we began. Let's just use civilization as a story. And the story of humanity begins in modern day Iraq through civilization. And this is a question. We think of civilization as projecting us on a trajectory of progress and modernity. And if usually any textbook begins the story in Iraq, it's also in Iraq where our modern civilization might begin to unravel at the same time, because climate change is so hitting this place so hard. And I want you to look at a place called Ur. Ur. Ur is where the first reference to a climate refugee occurs. And his name is Abraham, or who I'm named after, Ibrahim. I want you to think of the journey Abraham takes from Ur through the upper Mesopotamian basin to this piece of land that is being contested as I'm speaking at this very moment. And of course, that contested land, of course, Israel, Palestine, Levant, the Holy Land. Okay. Or Abraham could be one of the first examples of a climate refugee. Okay. And I want you to look at this map of Iraq. So, like I say, it's not surprising that the Garden of Eden, and remember, a lot of these river basins no longer exist. You just have the Tigris and Euphrates. And the Persian Gulf, of course, now is the present day coastline does not correspond to the biblical coastline. Okay. And then if we go further, okay, I want you to think of this. The Bronze Age collapse also occurred due to simply climate and fluctuations and the inability to feed the populations in these areas. Look at the places here, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and then you don't see it named down here, but it's the Red Sea. Um, and look at these places here. I want you to think yourself, in the year 1200, does this place sound familiar? Gaza? Gaza, basically the base for if you want to project power into Africa or vice versa. Do you see how this was contested in an area that was fought over by the Egyptians, the Canaanites, and then later the Hebrews? Okay. And what if I told you that this basically geographical area was important then? It's important now, and climate has an impact, okay, on the kind of conflicts that were happening here. And just as kind of a sad, tragic aside, I remember in the summer of 2023 writing an article about the situation of water in Gaza and basically concluding with this question. The situation of Gaza's water was so dire. The aquifers were so depleted. I asked myself this question: when a population is so thirsty, usually they're going to lash out in some kind of way. This is my assessment of the water situation in Gaza in the summer of 2023. And of course, all of you are now familiar with the events that kind of happened a month later on October 7th, 2023. And so speaking of this land, then, yes, it's if you look at the kind of the background of the historical Jesus, I want you to think of the historical Jesus, some of the miracles he performed, how much water is an important part of the story of the life of Jesus. You see, if you read the Bible as kind of a climate history document, okay? Uh, these places, Galilee, for example, how is that such an important place that was in the life of Jesus? And it's nothing has changed. Galilee is still an important contested water source to this very day. Um, Now, if I take the map of Iraq and go to the future, in the year 2014, I want you to look at this group called the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, when you come to San Diego, you probably are not going to realize that down from your campus is a place called El Cajon. And El Cajon is the home of a lot of people who fled the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Yes, that terrorist group might as well be called the Islamic State of the Euphrates and Tigris. Okay, and I'll tell you why. It's if you see how its geography was dictated by where the water was. And the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria might as well be called the Islamic State that mastered hydrological terrorism. And I'll tell you what do I mean by this. Deliberately depriving people of water or deliberately down flooding people downstream. The Islamic State's capital was in Raqqa. Now, Raqqa is important because it was there that the Syrian government had tried an experiment that failed in the Soviet Union, and that was making a particular river produce cotton. And of course, in the former Soviet Union, I'm talking about the case of the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan. In Syria, the state managed process of making this region self-sufficient in cotton not only mismanaged water, it depleted the aquifers, and a drought that occurred in 2008 led to a lot of displaced farmers. Those displaced farmers in 2008 went from the countryside to Raqqa. And it was in Raqqa that, as of 2011, a militia moved in, calling itself the Islamic State of Iraq in those days, and more or less offered those displaced farmers a salary. And by 2014, those displaced farmers, some of them fighting in ISIS that were coming from Raqqa, moved all the way to the outskirts of Baghdad. The Iraqi military collapsed. Now, who ended up defending the south of Iraq were these ad hoc Shia militias. No, those Shia militias, who did they recruit from? Displaced farmers from that southern basin that I showed you earlier, or those places are still marshes, and the marshes of Iraq were more or less destroyed by an act of political ecology. There's two tragic anniversaries coming up. August 2nd was the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Now, why was that a tragic anniversary? Was because as a result of the conflict that has ensued, Saddam did two acts of political ecocide. He deliberately flooded the Gulf with oil to prevent an amphibious assault, and then later he diverted the waters going down to the marshes to basically flush out Iraqi rebels trying to overthrow Saddam. That's the first tragic anniversary. The other one is coming up on August 2nd. I wear a shirt with Japanese cranes. We're also forgetting, not related to this class, it's the 80-year anniversary on August 6th of the bombing of Hiroshima. So, two tragic anniversaries. But when Saddam drained the marshes in an act of political ecocide or political ecology, the marshes never were able to recover to this very day because once the diverted canal Saddam built were dismantled, nevertheless, the damage had been done. Higher temperatures meant the marshes could never recover due to evaporation, as well as hydropolitics, dams that were built upstream in Turkey. So, as a result, this is what the Garden of Eden might look like today. These are the sandstorms that are hitting Iraq. Okay. And if you can't really use this area to create agriculture when you have this much sandstorms. You don't have enough water, right? And it wouldn't have been unusual to think that in ISIS, you would have had displaced Syrian farmers fighting displaced Iraqi farmers on the opposite side of the front lines. Now, I want you to look at the scenery in Iraq because this kind of dystopian scenery reminds me a lot of the imagery in the blockbuster film Dune. So I'm going to give you a couple of assignments, how to think about climate change in both fiction and, of course, nonfiction. Dune is a very good example of what we call cli-fi, climate fiction. Another great film, also starring Timothy Chalamet, the great author, a great cli-fi actor, is Don't Look Up. And both of those are ways to get your generation to think of climate change in a different way. You see, Dune was written in the 1960s by a guy named Frank Herbert, but when it's made into a film in the 21st century, the aspects that deal with climate are much more pronounced. If you want, you could watch a really bad version of this film in the 1980s. It's called Dune, starring Sting. Oh, what does that sound like? It sounds a lot like Iraq. Arrakis was once a fertile planet that was green and full of water. And what happened on Arrakis? They didn't manage the water properly. And as a result, it becomes this desert planet, which is mined for its spice that allows intergalactic travel. Think oil that allows today's travel. Okay. And I want you now to think of the first woman with agency in this film. Think of the character Zendaya. And if you haven't seen this film, make that your assignment. The way Zendaya practices what I call climate resiliency, climate adaptation. And this also is just a very good example of she is the one who teaches the outsider, the fish out of water, Timothy Chalamet, to adapt to the desert environment, for example. Then let's go to some real life characters. Of course, if this last name sounds familiar, that's not an accident. She's my aunt. Habiba Al-Marashi is a water hero in the year 2018. She's the first in the United Arab Emirates who created a basically an environmental advocacy group called the Emirates Environmental Group. Now, you have to imagine the 1990s for a woman in a very patriarchal society to do this was unheard of. But here she is to this very day is, one person who is, I would say, just a very good example of a woman making a difference. And then if you want other things you could do on the USD campus is start book clubs. One book I highly recommend is written by a woman of Iranian heritage, Zahra Biabani, Climate Optimism. And if you don't have time to read the book, watch the TED Talk. And all of this deals with the kind of field of what I call climate resilience. And it's this, is that apathy is not going to help anyone. Climate resilience basically shows that in the face of these insurmountable challenges, whether it's a single woman here or whether it's my aunt or even a fictional character, Okay. These are prominent examples, but basically, you are entering a new age called the Anthropocene. And when I say gendering the Anthropocene, it means this: we humans are changing the environment in ways that are unprecedented in human history. The atomic bomb was the first. 80 years ago, we had the power of recreating the sun on Earth. In this day and age, now when we think of how does climate change disproportionately affect women? Okay, remember ISIS and the Iraqi shepherds, right? When they went into battle, they would die, leaving women to be single head of households. How do they survive in patriarchal societies? So in this particular case, a lot of widows went to beekeeping. Now, okay, beekeeping is a wonderful way to survive, but think, where do bees get their honey? From flora and fauna that depend on water. So you see how these kind of micro stories of how climate change might affect women disproportionately. What if I told you places in Iraq, the Gulf in particular, reach 150 degrees Fahrenheit? And if you don't have an air conditioner, and if you are pregnant, you see, I want you to think how that would disproportionately affect a woman over a man in this particular case. Okay. And then, of course, let's not forget in this article I wrote, where do you get water from? We take piped water for granted. But if you live in a village where all your water comes from a well, and that well dries up, and if you're a single head of household, you have to go to an Iraqi village where you're a stranger as a single woman. And of course, that also opens up the greater chances of gender-based violence when you go into this unknown territory. So, finally, to conclude, ways to think of climate change. I'm in Guatemala. Guatemala is one of the places that will probably be giving you your coffee on two wonderful cafes, Aromas and Palomas on campus. I'm very happy to say you could get your coffee there. But we tend to forget what I'm drinking, whether it's in Guatemala or in San Diego, where is a coffee plant that is called Coffee Arabica. Okay. Coffee Arabica, you probably don't realize, for most of human history, was shipped out through a port that was pronounced in Yemen, Yemeni Arabic, El Makha. You pronounce it Mocha. Mocha has nothing to do with putting chocolate in coffee. That's a coffee crime, by the way. It's in place. It's a place where most of the world's coffee came from. Mocha today is a battle zone. Okay. And this is one website I highly recommend to all of you. For any class you take, I can't recommend this website more. And basically, what it does is, so let's just take the case of Yemen, where coffee came from, right? If you go there, if you have a term paper, this is something AI can't really write for you. It's this kind of the creativity that is involved in going to this website. It's basically a interactive website that helps you understand the intersection of climate and conflict. Where if you go there, the weaponization of water during the Yemeni civil war, and it will give you this just wonderful interactive. Oh, sorry, those are the financiers. Okay, there you go. I want you just to look at what I'm showing you here. Conflict history, why history is important, the sources, the conflict parties, and also attempts at conflict resolution, which rarely, which also is just so important, understanding the intersection of conflict. Why is this important? Your coffee that you drink is also in zones that will be affected by climate change, and the price you might pay at Paloma and aromas might increase as a result, but also the price you're going to be paying, you have to realize who's collecting your coffee. Yemen's coffee crop ended because the country started to run out of water, besides not being able to compete with Brazil and Vietnam. And today, as we speak, Vietnam is probably the place where you're going to get most of your coffee from. And you probably don't realize it. Why is Vietnam giving you most of your coffee? It's because the US bombarded it with so much Agent Orange. Nothing else grows there. Now Vietnam can only grow coffee. Vietnam is the second largest coffee producer in the world as a result of us bombing it with a chemical weapon called Agent Orange. It doesn't have a bad effect on us, but that's just all an examples of how the conflict, the environment, and our daily lives intersect. All right, thank you. Want to end on that
On
note.
that one. All right, last but certainly not least is Dr. Cantzler. Please take it away.
Oh my gosh, thank you. I was having the same exact, I saw those tabs and I felt just a little bit better about myself. I get made fun of ceaselessly by my students, my kids, every time they see the tabs. They're just like, how can you function? Whew. All right, so hello, I am Julia Cantzler. I am going to tell you just a little bit about myself before I jump into talking about youth climate advocacy, which is something I've been putting a great deal of thought into lately. So I have been here, wow, 14 years at USD. It's hard to believe. I am a sociologist. My areas of emphases are really environmental sociology, as well as law and society. Prior to becoming a sociologist, I was an attorney. I represented mostly Native American tribes in California and in the center of the country, Colorado, Oklahoma, Utah, for several years, mostly on issues of environmental law. And then decided to go back and get my PhD, and I'm a sociologist now. And so I'm in the Department of Sociology, but I'm also affiliated with several other majors and minors on campus. So you'll find me affiliated with the Department of Environmental and Ocean Sciences, the Change-Making minor, the Food Studies minor, and the Law, Justice, and Society minor, which is new. And I'd say the Food Studies minor is very new too. So feel free, I have my contact information there to come chat with me anytime if you have questions about law, if you have questions about, environmental sociology, the major of sociology, or any of those other things. I'm always happy to share information. I'm also the co-founder and co-director of USD's Environmental Integration Lab. We are an organization on campus that really seeks to think about interesting and innovative ways to connect the work that's already being done on campus, whether it's in the classroom or with regard to research and scholarship or opportunities for students to become more engaged. We host programs around campus over the course of the year, so keep an eye out for that as well. My research is, I have two different prongs of research. One was a little bit of what I used to focus on, and I'm making a transition to something else at the moment. But I spent the last decade and more, probably the last 15 years, studying environmental justice and Indigenous peoples. And I ended up writing a book about that in the context of the US, Australia, and New Zealand, looking at fishing rights. More recently, I've been studying this topic, youth climate advocacy. And I have a current project that's going on looking at how to transform campus food systems and how students engage with food as a choice and whether the food that they choose reflects certain attitudes, values, morals, ethics around climate change, animal rights, farm worker rights, or cost, simply taste, basic things about food choice. Thinking about all of that in a context of how do we think about transforming campus food systems to be more sustainable, to be more just, to be more climate aware, et cetera. Okay, so I want to start off by talking a little bit about what sociologists do and what this has to do with climate change. So for those of you who don't know, sociology is the study of human social behavior. It's vast. Anything that people are doing collectively, sociologists can study it. So obviously, climate change kind of falls into this area a little bit. Sociologists can look at society in kind of every different way imaginable, but we tend to focus on different scales of society. So on the broadest terms, we study social structures. These are these big overarching systems that shape our society. So it could be the economy, it could be systems of law, it could be religion, it could be our modes of government. So if I'm a sociologist and I'm interested in studying climate change, some of the questions that I might ask would be, how does capitalism contribute to climate change, for example? I spend a lot of time actually talking about that very thing in my classes. Or what about certain religious beliefs? How do they contribute to either increased or decreased likelihood of accepting that climate change is real, or feeling a sense of moral or ethical responsibility to do something about it? So we can look at different religious orientations and how they manifest themselves in terms of people's beliefs, values, and actions with regard to climate change, as well as many, many, many other questions in that area. I would say the second layer, sort of moving downward, that sociologists study would be institutions. These are these complex social forms or organizations that reproduce themselves over time. They don't necessarily depend on one specific group of people, but exist over the course oftentimes of years, decades, generations. So these could be things like schools or universities or corporations or even social movements. And if we want to think about institutions and climate change, we could ask how different education systems lead to different levels of climate change awareness. So you might be interested in, if some of you went to public school and others went to a private high school, was there a categorical difference in terms of how climate change was talked about? Did some of you go to religious high schools? Did that change the way that climate change was talked about in those contexts? We could also look at, and in fact, I look at how social movements emerge to address climate change and what the dynamics of those social movements are. The next level down, our sort of smallest micro level of analysis and examination would be the interactional level. Here's where sociologists look at individual and small group behavior and study that to see what its relevance is to any particular topic. So with regard to climate change, we could ask, what are those individual actions that people take to address climate change? I may talk to you all individually and say, hey, what are the things that you do? Do you travel differently? Do you eat differently? Do you have that plant-based diet that Dr. Talley was talking about? And we can look at all of that. We could also look at kind of small group interactions in terms of how people talk to each other about climate change. There are lots of studies out there that sit down with young people, for example, and kind of listen to how they discuss the issue, listen to the way they frame it, how they articulate it to each other, and whether or not those conversations have an impact on sort of how people orient themselves to the problem. Sociologists also study culture. It's a big, nebulous body of values, beliefs, norms, ideas. We can see culture in terms of the stories that we tell, the narratives that we create, but it could be in those fictional depictions as well of a particular topic. So when Dr. Al-Marashi was talking about Dune, for example, these climate narratives, this climate fiction, there's a whole body of them out there that we can examine that really tell us, something about climate change, but they often tell us more about our society, our context. And you can even look at them over time and how they've been written and really get a sense of how people's own ideas about ourselves and our future and how we understand and think about climate change evolves over time. There is a fabulous article that actually talks about Wakanda, and it's called Wakanda Doesn't Have Suburbs. And I believe it's by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson. Just trying to get this. If you can find this article, I highly, highly recommend it. But it talks about the fact that we have so many fictional narratives out there that really articulate climate change as apocalyptic, right? And inevitable, that there's this inevitability about human beings destroying their planet. And Wakanda in Black Panther is kind of this perfect alternative in a way. And looking at a fictionalized society that has a lot of technology, but chooses to live within its bounds and live in sort of symbiosis with the natural world. And how the argument is we need more of these, right? We need more creative narratives about the possibility of the future that don't inevitably end with we destroy the planet and we have to colonize Mars. Instead, it's here's the possibility of what we can achieve. And then when we have that sense of the possible, then maybe we can actually make it happen. Okay, so question we could ask about culture. How some cultural values present obstacles to climate change, or opportunities, I would say. In the United States, we have this prevailing narrative around individualism. And what we know from talking to people and thinking it through, and through analysis, is that this individually focused narrative tends to align more with individual actions to address climate change. So real pressure on people as individuals to reduce, reuse, recycle, to change their diets, to change the way they, commute around the world, rather than focusing on broader industrial or corporate strategies or broad scale government policies and regulations. So maybe there's something about this narrative around individualism that's tied to different types of strategies. Power and inequality. This is really the bread and butter for sociology. Sociologists are very much concerned, most of us, I would say, in our work with how power is wielded in society and by who benefits from existing power structures, and how power and inequality are distributed across societies. So if we're thinking about climate change here, we might be asking questions about whether disadvantaged groups are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Spoiler alert, they are, very much so. And we heard about this a little bit in the two previous talks. And so the way that we kind of understand this as sociologists, the way that we theoretically frame this is in terms of environmental inequality, that there is real inequality in terms of both the causes and the impacts of environmental problems and climate change in particular. In that the social movement, the way that people address this, the way that they organize to address it, is around what we call environmental justice. And many of you have probably heard the term environmental justice before. It's not so much about justice for the environment, but it's rather taking a justice framework and applying it to how we understand environmental problems. It really elevates and centralizes the experiences of marginalized communities who are really facing the brunt of most environmental and climate impacts. Okay, so that's just a few examples of what sociologists study when it comes to climate change. There are many, 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 many. And I teach classes on this. So if you're interested in any of this, absolutely, I would love to see you in my classes. Okay, so sociology of youth climate advocacy. What can sociologists like me bring to the table when we're studying young people and how young people think about and engage with the issue of climate change? Well, first, we need a baseline understanding of what advocacy means, some sort of working definition. So one might be, an advocate is someone who is intentional about solving a social or environmental problem, is motivated to act, and engages proactively in order to achieve change in one's own life, in the lives of others, or in the broader community. You might notice that this does not mean necessarily to be an advocate, you have to be an activist. You don't have to be out there protesting, joining protest movements, engaging in civil disobedience in order to be an advocate. There are many ways that you can do this. Advocacy involves individual actions that many of you are probably taking already in your own lives. Educating yourself about climate change, educating others, talking to others about it, engaging in some lifestyle modifications, whatever those might be. Advocacy also includes individual and collective activism. Most of you probably know Greta Thunberg. We'll talk about her in a second. You also saw a little bit about her in the film that I suggested that you watch. She engaged in school strikes as a lone person sitting in front of the Swedish parliament, not going to school and saying, how can we possibly go to school when our world is burning, basically. So individual activism, collective activism, protest, land occupations, there's many ways to engage in activism. Advocacy also includes civic engagement, so more policy-oriented work, working on political campaigns, working with communities, doing community engagement, volunteering, and voting in ways that promote the climate issue in a particular way. So sociology is particularly well suited to examine youth climate advocacy in terms of the questions that we ask. And so questions like, what are young people's attitudes about climate change? Do they tend to take action in their own lives? And if so, what does this action look like specifically, and how does it differ from other generations? Those could be questions we ask, and we do. And then we answer these questions by gathering data. Oftentimes, this is survey data. Go and ask a whole bunch of people what they think. Or we interview them, we sit down with them, we ask these questions. Or we'll look at the historical record and build a historical analysis of whatever we're interested in. And then we analyze that data systematically by testing our hypotheses that in and of themselves are driven by sociological theory. So I want to give you a little bit of information, some survey data out there to let you know what we already know. What do we already know about young people in terms of the questions that we've asked them with regard to climate change? Well, we know that young people are quite concerned about climate change, and to a greater extent than other generations. Specifically, around 70% of people aged 16 to 25 around the world are extremely worried or very worried about climate, according to a study that covered 10 countries and was published in The Lancet. So this is the one on the left here. And these percentages were even higher in many developing countries that are expected to face the worst consequences of climate change. And this isn't particularly surprising, right? I mean, you see the Philippines up at the very top. They have very low-lying areas that are experiencing some sea level rise already. Other developing nations, we already talked about India a little bit. And then there's the United States. Even in the United States, almost 50% of young people were either extremely worried or very worried about climate change. We also know that climate change influences how young people think about their futures. So we see some here with the right-hand survey in the right-hand table. The question being, do you think climate change will influence the following in your future? And these are asking Americans between the ages of 13 to 29. Do you think it's going to impact where you live in the future? 63% of young people asked said, yeah, they think it will. Do they think it'll impact what you eat? 43% yes. How you travel? Over half said yes. What you buy? 50% yes. Whether to have kids? That's a third of all people asked in this age bracket said, yeah, they think that climate change is going to impact their decision about whether they have kids. And only 50, I think this is pretty telling right here. Only 15% of young people in the United States believe that climate change will have no influence on their future. So that is 85% of young people believe that climate change is going to impact them in some way. I thought this was interesting. Younger adults are more likely than older adults to feel anxious, motivated, and angry when they see social media content focused on addressing global climate change. We know that young people obviously are avid social media consumers. They get a lot of information from social media. So what's the impact of that when they're looking at content that's related to climate change on their attitudes about climate change? And you see it broken down by generation here, which I think is really quite interesting. So the question being, does looking at social media content make you feel anxious about the future? 51%, so over half of all users said yes, but you can see the breakdown here with Gen Z and millennials is much higher. Does it make you motivated to learn more about climate change? Just under half said yes total, but over half of Gen Z and millennials said yes. This one I think is great. Does it make you confident that we can reduce the effects of climate change? Just under half said yes, but over half of Gen Z said yes. Does it make you angry that not enough is being done? Almost half of Gen Z and millennials says yes, it makes them angry. So there's a couple takeaways that I take in here, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the political divide in a second. But one of the main takeaways here is that it actually motivates people. There is a narrative out there that this constant media barrage of information is making people feel anxious. Yes, that's true. But that anxiety is translating into a lack of action or an apathy. And I think what this suggests, especially for young people, is that's not necessarily the case. That a lot of them see this happening, educate themselves, and then are motivated to do something about it. This is really interesting and perhaps not surprising for many of you to check out. They also looked at the data and analyzed it in terms of people who identify as Republican or leaning Republican versus Democrat and leading Democrat. And what you find is that, yes, there is a political divide, there's a party divide in terms of how people think about climate change and how people respond to their consumption of social media that depicts climate change. So these party divides are real, but I would suggest that they're not particularly indicative of intractable attitudes or lack of potential bipartisanship across the climate issue, especially when you're looking at the actual numbers. Does it make them anxious about their future? About a third said yes, Republicans. A quarter were motivated to learn more. A third felt confident that they could reduce the effects of climate change. All of that demonstrates that there is a sizable portion of the Republican Party, of people who associate with the Republican Party, that feel that climate is an important issue. And what you don't see here, which I think is even more telling right here in this important aside, is that there are actual generational differences in climate change attitudes and behaviors within the Republican Party. 49% of Gen Z and 48% of millennial Republicans say that action to reduce the effects of climate change needs to be prioritized today, even if that means fewer resources to deal with other important problems. And this is significantly different and higher than for Gen X and baby boomers. And this is massive to me. For one, sort of going back just to the percentages of everyday Republicans that are concerned about this issue. When you think about policy decisions, they're usually made by sort of razor thin margins of support. So you don't need to convince everybody across the aisle that something is important in order to change the issue. You only need to change a few minds. And here you've got a quarter to a third of Republicans that they're already there. They just need to be convinced to vote a certain way. And then if you look at the fact that it's half of young Republicans that feel that this is very, very important and they're willing to prioritize this, suggests that the narratives that seek to divide are just narratives, right? That there is a place for change, that it is likely to occur. This alignment of values with action is likely to happen because young people recognize just how important this issue is. So there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful in terms of real action happening. Okay, so we know that young people are motivated. We can also tell that that motivation aligns with greater climate action. So here's a survey here from the Yale program on climate change communication. Younger generations of Americans are more likely than older generations to support and identify with climate activists. Here, this is the question, are strongly or somewhat support climate activists? 62% of millennial or younger. Identify with climate activists a great deal, 45%, which suggests that many of them feel like they are activists. They do engage with this in their everyday lives. And you can tell that they are based on some of the answers to this one on the right. Climate change should be a top priority. You've got 67% of Gen Z, 71% of millennials. Addressing climate change is my personal top priority. About obviously higher numbers for Gen Z and millennials. I've personally taken action to help address climate change within the last year. I've talked about the need for action on climate change at least 2 to 3 times in the past few weeks. Sorry, 1 to 2 times in the past few weeks. I've seen content on social media in the past few weeks, and I've engaged on social media with content. And then here's another more detailed table that shows a little bit what that action looks like. Younger generations of Americans are more willing to engage in climate activism than older. So what specifically are they doing? 61% have, this is a percentage who definitely or probably would take the following actions with regard to global warming. 61 would sign a petition, 59% would vote for a candidate, 50% publicly display a t-shirt, share info on social media. This is obviously a little bit lower, but higher than every other generation. Volunteer time at an organization, support an organization engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience, donate money, join a campaign, attend a political rally, engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. Over a quarter of them said they would do that. This is my favorite one. Young people actually do see themselves as agents of change. They feel hopeful, they feel empowered. You can see this. Younger generations of Americans are more confident that they can influence decision makers than older generations are. And so the green captures millennials or younger. And the question is, how confident are you that people like you working together can affect what, and then fill in the organization here, do or does about global warming? And these are folks that are extremely, very, or moderately confident. So how confident are you that you can change the minds of local businesses? Pretty confident. 62% of millennials are younger compared to Gen X and baby boomers. Your government, do you feel like you can change your local government? Yeah, over 50%. Your state government, still over 50%. Corporations, getting a little bit lower, but more than anybody else. And then the federal government, about the same as corporations. I love this chart because it demonstrates that young people feel hope and empowerment. They feel like this is something that they can take on and that they can succeed at. I also think this demonstrates how young people have an ability to see broad, entrenched political and economic systems, which we think are as entrenched, as less entrenched, that they're more malleable, that they're not necessarily forever. These are not systems that we have to inevitably continue to deal with forever. Big things can change. I also love the recognition of the importance of focusing on the local level, which often gets overlooked. I think when we're talking about climate change and policy, we're often talking about the federal government or globally, and those things can seem really, really scary and difficult to address in any way, to challenge in any way. But we know that grassroots bottom-up changes are incredibly powerful, and then oftentimes they percolate up to the national level and to the global level. Also, climate impacts happen locally. So if we can focus on our local communities where things are happening now, that change that we can make can be the change that people can feel very impactfully in their own lives, can make real meaningful difference to people. So I think this is fantastic in terms of demonstrating where young people are at in terms of their motivation and their sense of empowerment and agency. So all of these data give us a clearer picture of the context, which we already probably know, right? It's that young people are actively engaged in climate activism. We've seen this in social media. We also know that many of them are taking leadership positions in this movement. But while this survey data might give us a sense of their level of concern and engagement, it really doesn't give us the full story in terms of why people are motivated to act, what they're doing, how they're turning their concerns into action, how they see themselves individually in terms of these structures and as agents of change. And this is where sociologists like to round this out with in-depth qualitative interviews, ethnographic sociological studies, deep historical contextual studies, et cetera. So from these more in-depth narratives, some of the things that we've learned are the following. Like, why are young people taking on this work? How do they see themselves? Well, we know, and young people are saying, that they're more likely to make connections between the effects that they're witnessing firsthand, extreme weather events, droughts, fires, heat waves, and climate change. These aren't seeming just like, natural disasters that just happen or acts of God. They are seeming like very rational, realistic outcomes of processes they know are going on. They are accepting the reality of the science, as well as the challenging economic and political factors that contribute to climate change. Also, they really believe that their future is at stake. They're concerned about the kind of world they'll inherit and the potential for a drastically altered environment if greenhouse gas emissions are not reduced. They see this as an existential threat. Their very existence in their future is at stake. Also, they articulate the fact that adults are seen as losing their credibility in the eyes of young people to solve these problems, and that the generations that came before them really had this disproportionate hand in creating these problems, and yet are not stepping in to do anything about it. So they feel compelled to act because they don't believe that others will. They also see themselves as uniquely equipped to handle these challenges. They clearly have the moral authority, but they also have time. If you think about how young people's time is oriented versus those who enter the workforce as they get older, and this is the same for all different social movements, right? Young people have the time. They're also less invested in the status quo, right? They haven't yet had those decades of work and the financial realities that go along with it. So they are more willing again to see the possibility of undoing those structures. They're well equipped to use social media, obviously. And this is a very, very powerful mobilizing strategy for many of them. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up, but I wanted to introduce you to a few prominent youth climate activists and hear what they have to say about why they're personally involved in climate change or how they view the issue. And then just to reflect a little bit on how this is important in terms of sociological themes. So most of you probably know Greta Thunberg. She's Swedish. She's now 22 years old. She started striking for the climate from school in front of the Swedish parliament when she was 16 years old. And within months, hundreds of thousands of high school and college age youth around the world were joining her in school strikes for the climate. This quote here, one of her most famous quotes, "I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic. I want you to feel the fear I feel every day. I want you to act. I want you to act like you would in a crisis. I want you to act like your house is on fire because it is." There's a lot of debate and discourse right now about the types of narratives that we should be using to motivate people and the concern about the panic and fear narrative versus the hope narrative. And I think that those are very valid arguments. But I would say that her leaning into the panic and fear one is appropriate in many ways because it articulates that young people really sense the urgency of the problem. They understand this better than most and are pushing others to do the same, even those from other generations, right? When she gave this speech, she was talking to older folks like, we need you to act. Like, this matters to you. It's not just about us. This is the time of crisis. We are running out of time. We need to act now. And I think that's what a lot of young people articulate as well. This is our Children's Trust. They are an organization in the United States that launches youth-led climate lawsuits and legal actions. Since 2010, I believe they've launched lawsuits in all 50 states. Their most famous case was Juliana versus United States. And in this one, a group of 21 school-age kids in the US sued the US government on behalf of all American youth and future generations, arguing that the US government violated their constitutional rights by failing to take measures to meaningfully address climate change. And this was, groundbreaking and unprecedented. And ultimately, the courts have been very sympathetic to their claims, yet have not been able to find the constitutional and legal foundation in order to find for them. So they have faced roadblocks along the way, and their case has been dismissed by multiple courts. And I think in a lot of ways, even though this is ongoing, what it really demonstrates is kind of the limitations of US law as a mechanism to address climate change. But they're not giving up. They're continuing to push and to try to find new legal angles to hold governments accountable. And they are certainly, lawsuits like this are having a lot more traction and luck globally than they are in the US. And so this is really part of a broader movement, an important movement that young people are leading. This is Isra Hersey. She's a climate activist from Minnesota. She is among a growing number of young activists of color who remind us that climate change is not a white middle class issue and that people of color bear a disproportionate brunt of climate impacts. In this quote, she's talking about her struggles as a young Black woman in the climate movement. And I don't think that her experience is unique to hers. The environmental movement in the United States has always been, very much dominated by white elites. And so broadening that umbrella to include young people of color has been kind of long and contested, but I think that it's happening, and I think it's happening now more than ever. And this is in the US and globally. I think we're seeing a climate movement that is increasingly diverse and intersectional, in addition to really the climate movement centering the voices and experiences of people of color. There's also more solidarity between climate movements and movements for other sorts of social justice issues like racism, sexism, colonization, poverty, etc. What we're seeing, I think, is young people articulating that they view environmental and social problems as connected and linked to the same political and economic systems and cultural attitudes. Colonization, free market capitalism, racism, all of these things are connected from the same, they spring from the same well in terms of how power and inequality are distributed in our society. And historically, I think these movements kind of operated on their own in little silos. And increasingly, we're seeing the connections that are being made between the movements and the leadership of the movements. And I think this is really powerful in terms of broadening climate activism globally and really being able to address the systematic problems that are generating these social issues. Okay, last one. Tokata Iron Eyes. She's from the Standing Rock Sioux Nation in North Dakota. She was one of the primary organizers of the protests against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. I've worked with Indigenous leaders and activists quite a bit over the last couple decades. And I firmly believe that they are among the best suited to be leaders in climate action for many reasons. One, they tend to live in the areas that are most vulnerable to climate change. They have deep-seated cultural values that promote stewardship of the natural world. This is part of the air that they breathe. This is their cultural traditions. But also, they have literally lived for centuries, if not millennia, with this traditional ecological experience of protecting their natural world. They have so much experience, so much cultural, so much scientific experience with their landscapes and with climate change and dealing with it and addressing it. They are really the ones that should be in positions of authority and power in addressing this. And, and historically, I think they've really been marginalized from the movement, but I also think this is changing, which is great. I love this quote in particular because it reminds everyone that we are part of nature, that we are all responsible for the negative impacts of development on the natural world and on each other, and that ultimately we're all responsible for finding solutions as well. So it's a call to action for everyone, not just her generation. Okay, final slide. Takeaways. What do we know? We know youth are concerned about climate change and they're willing to take action. No big surprise there. They're also particularly well suited to lead these movements. But I want to add that just because they are taking these leadership roles and they are doing all of this work does not mean that we must or should leave climate activism exclusively to the young. There are potential pitfalls here. One is a huge amount of anxiety and burnout that it entails if you are telling an entire generation this is your work to be done. You're already hearing it from young people that this work is ceaseless, that it's tiring, that it's important, but it's draining them. They shouldn't be the only ones that are out there doing the work. Second issue is it allows entire generations of people to abdicate responsibility for this big global problem, that they created in a lot of ways, saying, oh, we don't have to worry about it, we'll just leave it to the young. And finally, there's real lost opportunities for solidarity, growth, and power when you are saying only one generation needs to take care of this. Older generations have lots of experience with activism as well. The civil rights movement, the anti-war movements, the anti-globalization movements, you name it. There's a lot of solidarity and knowledge and momentum that can be built by joining forces. So our goal should really be inclusive movements across generations, across issue areas, across political party affiliations, across demographic and geographic characteristics that center diverse voices, ideas, leadership structures, and strategies of action. So that was a lot of talking, and I realized I took a while, so I'll stop there.
Well, wonderful. I want to thank all of you. Please let's give a round of virtual applause at least to Doctors Al-Marashi, Cantzler, and Talley. I want to thank all of you students as well for being so engaged and for every way that you've engaged, including your assignments, and I appreciate all of those who've asked good questions. And we'll see you next week for another round. Thanks, everyone.